everyone, my name is Hedaia. I'm a political science major and a third-year transfer student at UC San Diego. Today, I'm with Quaye.
Hi everyone, my name is Quaye. I am a political science public law major. I am also a third-year transfer student at UCSD.
And we're both in Ethnic Studies 104, and we tend to debrief after this class, so here we are on the record now. This class we're in is called Race, Space, and Segregation, and we're going to discuss a few topics today. And the first thing we will be discussing is how do you define space and interact in spaces?
So first to start off, this is a working definition that the two of us have gathered throughout the readings and lectures of this class. Space is a social construct created around the spatialization of race that was fabricated by the colonization of countries, which lingers in the racialization of space and spatialization of race within today's society.
So we know this is a hefty definition, and we're going to dissect it right now. The first thing we want to talk about is the spatialization of race. So this is the literal displacement, emplacement, bordering, and policing in space of peoples and communities physically circumscribed to certain places. So the spatialization of race is essentially a way to physically border off communities, especially marginalized ones.
In addition, we have the racialization of space, which is the ideological or symbolic attribution of racialized characteristics to specific bodies and places they are associated with this. This happens through mass media cultural representations, political campaigning, race baiting, policing practices, and many other various ways.
So the next part of the definition we want to talk about is the colonization of countries. The idea of imperialism and settler colonialism, which have happened in very many countries around the world, enacted by America to this day and by European countries, is something that has created this idea of space and race, which are the social constructs that we're referring to. Space is essentially something that colonizers thought that they could keep occupying and taking and benefiting from, but at the cost of another person's life, essentially. We can bring up how the Europeans came over to Turtle Island and occupied indigenous spaces, and how that has still yet to be acknowledged, and the cruelties done to the indigenous and native populations were essentially never reimbursed for, and you can't really reimburse someone for taking over the land. The only thing you can do is give it back. And as we see in this society, they're not going to be giving it back. So pretty much, we're also going to bring up how this class also gave us a lot of resources of which we can refer to. And one of them I want to refer to is Social Geographies of Race, Connecting Race and Space by Brooke Neely and Michelle Samura. They bring up how the domination itself of race and space revolves around how groups marked as racially inferior have been defined, confined, regulated, and eradicated through the control of space. So what do you think about this, Quaye? Is space today used as a means to define, confine, and regulate certain groups?
I definitely think today we still see the repercussions of the colonialism that has been ingrained into our society around spaces where people are, based on race, are included or excluded into spaces, into communities, into various groups, whether they can be accepted or not. So we definitely see that definition of being defined, confined, regulated, and eradicated is still controlling our spaces throughout, urban to suburban areas and rural areas. And yeah,
I completely agree. Especially from what we're learning in class, is that these borders, recently we learned about the walls that have been built and are still being built. Borders that are lines that are being drawn as borders to segregate areas and to make sure that we have a confined space of a certain nationality, and that to keep people out, I think borders and walls are 100% more so to keep people out than to protect, quote unquote, protect people on the inside. There's that negative connotation when it comes to space and race, because we live in a white man's world. We live in America where everything is so instilled into the idea of mine, consuming and trying to protect what is ours. And I think we are so nationally inclined to claim America as ours, to the point that we're always regulating, keeping people out. When Trump was inaugurated, we had the Muslim ban. He also instilled the wall that has been being built between the Mexico and American border. All these examples show how space and race are 100% used to define and confine and regulate very many marginalized communities.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen that through like the segregation at the border, specifically physical barriers, which is very interesting because obviously we've had a past history of, physical barriers in segregation of, black versus white people, but we've kind of moved away from those physical barriers, even though they're still in place. They may not be physical, but there's definitely still that separation of space, spatialization of, race. But we still can look at, the Mexico border and see how there's physical walls being built between races, something we don't see in the Canada border as much. The patrolling is a completely different thing, and it's very clear that this is racially motivated and targeted in that way, that we have a perception of who should be, once again, included and excluded and be welcomed. And that has been heightened since, Trump's place in office, and we've seen a lot of practices that have targeted people of color.
Exactly. I think this is a perfect segue into how we used examples from on a national standpoint and a universal standpoint about borders and how they're very apparent all over the world.
So taking it more from that national level to a more local level, both me and Hedaia grew up in Northern California and have, specific experiences, growing up. Hedaia, close to the Bay Area, me, visiting the Bay Area a lot. There are specific, views and knowledge that we had of this area. And one of those things is clearly how separated and kind of segregated San Francisco and Oakland are. When we took a great look at the race and ethnicity in the U.S. Dot density map from Census 2020, you can definitely see there is still that like heavy segregation and separation between the two, and that racialization of space that is present throughout. San Francisco has a pretty high population of white and Asian individuals, where Oakland has a much higher Latinx and Black population, especially since there's more of an industrial side to Oakland as well. It has always been labeled, that way. So there's definitely that division, that separation between the two cities. And then,
looking at the dot map right now, we're seeing how there's also very prominent borders where races are cut off distinctively.
Very distinctive.
As we see here, like in Walnut Creek, in the valley, in the inland, the suburbs, everything, it's predominantly white area. And then as you soon try to like drift apart, even if there is a majority of one minority, it is in a specific area in San Francisco. Like here we can see that Walnut Creek's predominantly white. And then in San Francisco near Daly City, it's predominantly non-Hispanic or it's Latino populations along with Asian. And then there's never really a mix of the dots. It's very segregated based by race.
Very concentrated dots
concentrated
of races. It's, center city, San Francisco, very white, surrounding areas, predominantly more Asian. And then same with Oakland, center Oakland, you can see that there is a very dense population, very dense yellow color representing Black individuals in that area. Berkeley, you can kind of see where there's more of those white individuals again. And even out to Richmond, you can see that there's a heavy population of Latinx individuals out that way. There's clear borders between these shown through this map.
Speaking of areas surrounding Richmond, Quaye, I wanted to bring up how recently I went to the Bay, and I went to an event surrounding pretty much how to stop the gentrification, how to preserve my marginalized communities within Oakland. And in reference to the dot density map, we can see here how there's a certain white movement going into Oakland, and the gentrification occurring in Oakland is becoming more prominent just by walking in the streets. In areas where we have seen where there have been more people of color are now being renovated, and new houses, new buildings, freeways are being invested in. There's a lot of more investments going into Oakland, but at the cost of displacing a lot of minorities. And we can see that because there's amongst the Asian populations, the Hispanic and Latino populations in Oakland, there is a movement from Walnut Creek, Tan, which is the white alone populations, it's dragging down into Oakland and Berkeley. So I find that very interesting, and it's very much more towards the the East Bay, but definitely more north. So, yeah.
So, yeah, I agree, Hedaia. I've also seen a lot of that occurring in the Sacramento area as well. Past histories of urban renewal ideas kind of coming to fruition again, as well as a lot of eminent domain that you were talking about with investing in freeways and changing up areas. A lot of private investors coming in and taking up, small, local businesses that are predominantly owned by people of color. And in the South Sac Oak Park area, there's definitely been a transition over the years, which you can already kind of start to see on the race and ethnicity dot density map from the census in 2020, that there's definitely this movement that was just this Oak Park area was specifically and predominantly, Black individuals, Hispanic individuals, and we're starting to see from white individuals moving into this area, that same sort of gentrification of the area, private investors coming in, buying up these areas and small businesses, and as well as the fact that, Sacramento, a lot of individuals as well, historically has been more, that urban area, and, the difference of the suburban areas of the surrounding cities that showcases the white flight that we have.
Oh, yeah.
The town I grew up in, Roseville, specifically, predominantly white, very separated. And once again, you can see those segregation, those separation barriers between, the urban areas versus the suburban areas, contributing to, once again, the white flight, just kind of the Bay Area where there's those different barriers.
So transitioning these barriers into how they are existing in schools and educational institutions, Quaye and I want to move on and talk about educational apartheid. And one of the main things we want to pretty much address is how our upbringing in predominantly white towns, specifically I'm from Danville, California, in the suburbs of the East Bay, and Quaye.
And I'm from Roseville, California, also the suburbs of Sacramento.
And so we want to bring in our own experiences and how education has shaped us, and especially being around one predominant race, being white race, and how that's affected our own views of the world, and what happened when we came to, when we came to realize that there is diversity amongst us, but it is being pretty much conceptualized into strict lines. I could say that this diversity is being stripped away from us based on our locations.
With this in mind, we are going to move into how this affected education as well, and how these district lines shaped the spaces and races of education. Showcased in the video of The Power of an Illusion, we saw the ghettoization of urban areas and the creation of suburban areas, which resulted in white flight out of cities, which we just discussed with the race and ethnicity density map. And now moving into education, how that's been affected by the segregation of schools as well as cities. So looking at history, the Vice News article, School Segregation Didn't Go Away, It Just Evolved. Chang mentioned by the time the Supreme Court integrated schools in the 1954 case, Brown v. Board of Education, white families didn't want their kids to go to school with black children, so they had a very clear opt-out choice, the suburbs.
So with this in place, desegregation orders were put in place to ensure that there was no segregation within these suburban areas. Even though these desegregation orders were in place, this did not really remedy the public being socially segregated, and the continuous fight until this was overturned in the early 2000s, which then resulted back to separation through suburbanization.
Also mentioned in the Vice News article was proposing a question of how might a group deploy boundaries in the law and policy around that to remove themselves from having to share the resources from disfavored others. LSU law professor Chris Tyson responded with, that is the story of suburbanization. This was the basis of the creation of suburbanization. And after the desegregation orders were overturned in the early 2000s, that separation through segregation was once again in place, and is how education has also once again been affected through the suburbanization of schools and cities, which is showcased in how me and Hedaia both were raised in the suburbs, which were highly segregated, and our schools were highly segregated. Hedaia and I looked at the article School Segregation After Brown from ProPublica, which showcased the school districts and the statistics on populations in school districts. My personal school district, Roseville Joint Unified School District, included about 4% Black individuals, and my high school personally was 30% people of color and 3% Black. And Hedaia's school
was Monte Vista High School, which was part of the San Ramon Valley Unified School District, where we had 33% people of color and 1% Black. The entire district only had 2%. This just further enhances how the suburbs are still heavily segregated within our school and education systems, and that leads us into sort of questioning our educational upbringings and how living in this very segregated suburb has allowed us to view different perspectives while not even having that many perspectives to learn from.
This leads us into our final question to discuss, which is, in what ways did your education shape the ways of your experience growing up, and how did coming from a predominantly white school affect your views of spaces and races within your respective areas?
Well, growing up, Quaye, my dad emphasized how important it is for us to receive an education and to pursue an education. My parents are both immigrants from Palestine, and when they came to America, specifically California, they moved around a lot, and I have yet to really know why they settled down in Danville, California. But if you tell anyone from the Bay that you're from Danville, they automatically have a stigma on this town. It's a upper class, like rich, white, affluent suburb between two huge mountains. It's a valley, and people already have this negative connotation associated with it, especially if you tell people of color that you're from there. Sort of like I've always felt like I was an outsider in the town and outside of the town, because some people were like, oh, these people are like sellout. This family doesn't really know how it's like being immigrants or how it's like being people of color in America. However, we already do experience these microaggressions, the discrimination, the educational apartheid in the suburb because we're around so many white people, and we do stand out as non-white people. This pretty much affected me my entire life, up until I was 18. Growing up, I have just sort of put up more walls to protect myself, especially because my town was full of a lot of Republican-leaning politicians, citizens, and I would conform to these Republican values by putting up facades during, for example, like the pandemic. And I did that so that I can avoid any microaggressions. I pretty much used faking my own views and faking my personality, or faking who I was as a person, as a coping mechanism. I was never authentic to my personality and who I was.
Hedaia, I know you just mentioned how you felt the need to conform in this space that you grew up in because of the Republican values, the discrimination, the racism in the community, in the suburban area that you grew up in. Do you feel now that you're still trying to conform to that, or in this space, living here at UCSD now, do you still feel that form of conforming, or are you starting to finally get connected more with yourself and not feel that sense of pressure?
Well, see, I've had to reverse a lot of things that I've been just very accustomed to doing. I've assimilated a lot, and for the first time in my 20 years, I've had to now be like, oh no, it's okay. You can be vocal about your identity. You can be vocal inside a classroom. You can be vocal with your friends. You can be unapologetic about it. And it's very hard not to like walk around campus and have that in my mind when my automatic like reset every morning is like, all right, go back to hiding, like hide your personality, hide who you are as a person.
Put that mask on.
Exactly.
Once again. Yeah.
Put the mask on every morning. And I've found that in certain spaces where I'm like part of, like I've gone to like club meetings, however, people often mistaken me to be white. And I find that very interesting, is that I am white passing, but in the suburbs where I grew up, people asked me where I was from. They never like believed that I grew up in America or I was born in America. And it's funny because when they'd ask me where I'm from, I'd be like, well, I'm from here. And they're like, no, where are you actually from? And those are those interpersonal racist comments that I would get.
Microaggressions.
Yeah, microaggressions. And I would be like, I don't know what you guys mean. And it's like, Danville, where I grew up, uses this like racial profiling to segregate people who don't look like they quote unquote belong in that area. And I took that with me as I came to UCSD, is like, do I belong here? Where do I belong? Am I hiding? Like, when do I take off this mask? And is it like, can I throw it away? Can I finally throw it away because I'm in a new place with a lot more diversity? But at the same time, I'm still not finding people who are like me or look like me, because we are still a smaller group on campus. But there's different faces, there's different cultures, and I see that a lot at UCSD with like the diversity and the just people walking around campus, and I love it. It makes me feel a lot more comfortable, a lot more safe, which is ironic because my parents did move me to Danville because it was a quote unquote safe area. It was an affluent area. They could afford it at the time, and they're like, this is where our kids are going to get a good education, and they went there for an education. And now I'm in La Jolla, which is predominantly white, but not on campus. It's definitely a mix of races that you physically see. Maybe the statistics are different, but it's funny how like I have followed education, or I've followed wherever I locate myself, it's been followed through education. Like I came to UCSD because of how good it is, and ironically it is in a very white town, La Jolla, as people were associated with. So is Danville. But yeah, education.
So Hedaia, how do you feel in terms of like education systems, your interactions, or how people interacted with you through like students and teachers affected your way of interacting in educational spaces?
An extra pair of ears, an extra pair of eyes, an extra pair of hands, an extra pair of everything. Because that would keep me prepared in the sense that if anything, if like, I was always on the lookout. I was always on surveillance. I was always trying to listen. I was always trying to look, sort of feel my environment before I was able to let down any walls or put more up. I just became more cautious. That's a simpler way of saying I just got more cautious and more anxious going into classrooms. I my entire high school, middle school careers, I went into classrooms with a white person as my teacher, and I think the most exciting time in my life was when I discovered that the chemistry teacher spoke Arabic in high school, and I would voluntarily go to her class just to be in it. I fought to be part of her honors chem class, only because she spoke Arabic, and she was white passing like me, but she spoke my same language, and that was my native language. And that touch of home, that touch of feeling of like I can talk Arabic at school and I talk Arabic at home, that was the comfort I needed. And I think we lack diversity in faculties, and I know there's a lot of confounding variables that go around that, but at the same time, that comfort and diversity of having peers and people I look up to as teachers and professors, as other people of color, it's a whole different experience that I don't think anyone will be able to like say into words. I don't think I can speak it into existence. It's just a feeling. It's comfort. It's like warmth. It's like your mother's touch, is knowing that you have that person that you can go to and express yourself with no strings attached and no judgment, no fear or anything. And so it's affected me in bad and good ways, but at the same time, I know that there is that one lucky classroom that I'll have peers that are like me, or like class, or like diversity for one, before I have peers that are like me, and then a professor who comes from the same background. That is like a blessing in itself. But I think that the way that I've just approached education has just been very, very on edge and cautious for the most part.
Yeah, kind of sounds like you found comfort because you finally found that in this white space there was a space you were able to create with this one teacher in high school that shared, the same language, same experience as you. Exactly. Let alone, speaking the same language, but also white passing, share experiences. You found that space within this white community. Exactly.
And I don't think I'll ever be able to like I look back to that day that I figured out she spoke Arabic, and it's instilled in my mind. Like being so happy, like running home from the bus stop and telling mom that there's an Arabic speaking teacher on campus, and they were so excited, and they're like, oh my God, finally. Like, my parents have acknowledged that they placed us in a very white town, but it was at the cost of our education. Like, they were saying that if it's going to take assimilation and hiding our identity. And for them, they have already sacrificed a lot in their lives, and as immigrants, they're like, okay, I have to hide my identity again, it's fine. My kids can do it too. It's a sad reality, but it's what you have to sacrifice to receive that education due to educational apartheid and white flight and the segregation of district lines. That's what it comes down to. How do you feel, Quaye, in Roseville, and what similarities or differences can you derive from my experiences and your experiences coming from Roseville and Danville?
Yeah, Hedaia, I definitely saw some similarities and differences between Roseville to Danville. Roseville, also predominantly white school, predominantly white area, suburban community. Personally, growing up, I'm a white individual, and I grew up in this predominantly white area, which came with, definitely the invisible knapsack. We discussed in class a little bit about. I personally have a lot of privilege. I did not have to think about, a lot of these things. I did not face, discrimination and microaggressions because of the color of my skin. I, once again, very privileged in that way, but it affected my views of spaces and races growing up in this community, the frame that, teachers made or other students made about how communities were with respect to, superiority in our community versus other cities around, on basis of, color and race and stuff like that. So it definitely shaped, some of those things. And as I grew up, I started to, notice the way races and spaces kind of interacted with one another. I started to educate myself more on, the discrimination and the microaggressions and trying to understand where these things came from. And as I started to learn those things, I started to see a lot of it within my school, within my community, a lot of the racism that existed in this predominantly white suburban area that leaned heavily conservative, similar to Danville, for example. Like I said, because of my place of privilege, I didn't have to think about those things. And, there was some, racial stereotypes that were discussed, by family or by other individuals in the area that definitely had a perspective or view on me that it wasn't until later when I started to learn about these things and take, classes such as this one that I was able to really understand where these come from, because of spatialization of race, racialization of space. And those the white flight and urban versus suburban areas, those kind of things. I just grew up in this space that also affected my educational space as well in that manner, because my education in this predominantly white area did not touch on these concepts, didn't touch on any of these things. Most of my teachers were white, and these were concepts and things that they wouldn't mention, wouldn't discuss, were taboo. And especially in this conservative area, it was not respected, not received. And this definitely affected, not having these conversations, these discussions in education and, in this predominantly white area. A lot of people lacked, these concepts and lacked, the ability to see the way racialization of space occurs, spatialization of race occurs. And, my later years of high school, I started to uncover, some of those things and, noticed with friends and stuff how it affected them as well. I had some family friends who also, similar to Hedaia's family, who, tried to seek out that, affluent, suburban community that's better for their kids, better for their education. And in conversations with them, just talking about the community and the racism within it, they discussed how, they saw after that, community. And within it, they had all of this racism directed towards them. And, they were happy to give their kids, this better education and this better community, but at the same time it was harming them, and they had wished that they didn't move to a community like this. We discussed ethnic enclaves in class, and I think they were hoping, they wish they could have had that for their kids, someone that they see similar to, Hedaia having, her professor and connecting with, or her teacher connecting with her chemistry teacher. I think same thing. That's what they wished for their kids, to see something like that. And, instead they saw, the racism and the conservative people in this community that, who are, still trying to push out people of color and, keep this segregation and this separation between, races and separation within suburban areas. And they definitely face that. And I think a lot of people of color are still facing that in these, predominantly white suburban areas. And these topics of discussions were never anything that was, acceptable in my community, within education, the segregation within schools and stuff like that, educational apartheid. These were not concepts that were ever discussed or talked about. And, I think that's very similar to, Hedaia. She said, conforming, you have to conform to kind of the, Republican ideas, Republican values which is kind of pushing that like white agenda where, we don't have, topics or discussions over, the segregation and the unfairness within our communities and how racism still affects these communities and the spaces that we're in. And we're still seeing that within, Roseville and Danville, for example, of these suburban communities. And even throughout history, we still have these presences of segregations within schools, within communities, cities, states, and even national-wise.
So in this podcast, we discussed everything ranging from colonialism to space to gentrification to educational apartheid and everything in between. Again, my name is Hedaia and
Quaye,
and we are reporting to you from Ethnic Studies 104.
Thank you for the conversation, Hedaia, and thanks, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day, everybody.